This is Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque, continuing 16 years on air and online, helping you succeed in buying, selling, and investing in property. The best real estate strategies out there just for you.
Welcome to Real Estate This Week. Hi again, I'm Stephen Gasque, and I'm so glad you're with us as we talk about how to nail it every time, no matter what kind of real estate you want to do. Just you, me, and the best real estate guests in the country. Today, we're looking at the finish line, a successful settlement when the property changes hands from the seller to the buyer. We'll tell you how to make sure the deal stays on track, how to handle last-minute problems, and how to keep your money safe from real estate scammers. For all that and much more, let's talk to Nishad Khan, board-certified real estate attorney with Nishad Khan Law in Orlando, Florida. Nishad is also a broker, a speaker, and faculty member who teaches classes about the closing at the Orlando Regional Realtor Association. Nishad, welcome to Real Estate This Week.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. Excited to be here.
I am so glad you're here because you are an expert in real estate closings, and I have so many questions for you. First of all, in the summer of 2025, how's business in Orlando?
Well, we're in an interesting time right now. There are some challenges that are currently facing the U.S. residential real estate market, such as high mortgage rates. Mortgage rates are still about 7% for first-time or younger buyers, which is really dragging on the home sales and trapping current owners in existing loans. And this usually will limit supply. Home prices remain elevated. The builders are cutting back on new construction, and there's some unsold inventory that's rising. So it's definitely a buyer's market. And those individuals who are looking to buy, now is the time to purchase, because I think that the sellers are starting to become a little bit more desperate in selling those properties, and you see the value start coming down.
Nishad, that is such a great observation because I have heard that from realtors in the southern parts of the United States, that more and more homes are coming on the market. And of course, for buyers, that means more choices when they're looking for homes, and also less competition.
That's correct. Yeah, buyers have a lot of options, and they'll have a lot of power in dictating those offers, which is a stark contrast from what the market looked like a few years ago when sellers were getting multiple offers.
Interesting. And now that we're in 2025 and the pandemic is way back in the rear view mirror, are settlements happening in person in Orlando, or does just the buyer show up and the seller does everything by electronic documents? How does a settlement work in today's market?
Yeah, so in today's market, Stephen, most people are trying to avoid the closings where everyone shows up at the closing table. The sellers are coming in separately. Buyers are coming in separately. Sometimes sellers don't even come in to sign closing documents and are doing things electronically. Most states have adopted remote online notarization, which makes it easier to sign closing documents from your cell phone or even your laptop. So I think most people are using electronic devices to get these transactions closed, and less people are actually showing up to the closing.
And so in today's market, Nishad, if I am one of those buyers who is lucky and I get the house I love and put it under contract, and now I am headed to the closing table, what should I know as I begin that stretch from the ratified contract to actually taking possession of that house?
So you don't want to show up the day of closing to review documents or any due diligence items that you may have obtained for the purchase of that house. That's the thing you don't want to do. And that's, unfortunately, that's the way a lot of buyers handle these closings is they don't worry about anything until the day of closing and start looking at things and noticing issues and asking questions. And that's just not the right way to do it, Stephen, because a lot of these contracts have deadlines. And if there are any issues or any areas of concern, you need to raise them within a certain time period. And if you don't raise those issues within a certain time period, then the window shuts and you can't raise them again. So my advice is if you're not going to show up to closing, not a problem. At least make sure you are reviewing everything ahead of closing with enough time that if you have any questions or concerns, you can address those questions and concerns. And if anything's serious, you still have the time to pull out of the contract if necessary.
Excellent. And so, Nishad, if I do get a house under contract and your firm will represent the closing, let me ask you this. What sort of communications will you be directing my way, talking about the buyer to begin with, and what's in them and what should I know about them?
Sure. So the first thing is you want to make sure that you receive some sort of verification of your deposit. Deposits are always important in real estate contracts. The next thing you probably want to look at is the title commitment. Make sure you understand what's on the title commitment, what exceptions are on the title commitment. And a title commitment is, it's a title insurance policy. So it's just like any other insurance policy. There's going to be exceptions and there's going to be risks that are covered. So you want to make sure that none of the exceptions are going to become problems. For example, in an association or a condominium, the condominium or association documents will be an exception. And sometimes those documents have restrictions on what you can do. If you wanted to build a mother-in-law suite in your house, you may have a problem doing that if the HOA documents don't allow you to. So those are the things that you want to look at. You also want to look at a survey. What's the property boundary? Are there any fences that are coming onto my property? Or is there anything from my property going onto the neighbor's property? This is not something you want to look at the day of closing, which unfortunately most buyers do. Looking at this at the day of closing is too late. If there's a survey issue, you have to bring it up within a certain time period, giving the seller the opportunity to fix that problem before closing.
And another question. Now that I'm on my way to the settlement table, what should I be doing as a buyer to make sure that deal and everything stays on track, including the mortgage?
Right. So closing means that you're satisfied with everything regarding this property. So the buyer should definitely have done their final walkthrough of the property to make sure it's in a condition that they're satisfied with. All of the seller's personal items have been removed. The buyer should make sure they look at the closing figures and that they're comfortable with the closing figures, whether they're estoppel fees, whether they're loan fees, whether they're title fees. The buyer should definitely make sure they have proper insurance. A lot of times buyers will go in and close in the house and find out later that the house is uninsurable because no one looked into this. So you want to make sure the house is uninsurable. These days, especially places like Florida, there's a lot of insurance issues that are coming up, such as flooding or roofs, or if there's hurricane damage. So insurance is a big topic right now. And so you want to make sure that your house is insurable. And again, of course, looking at the due diligence items we spoke about, the title commitment, the survey exceptions, any other item that would concern the property itself. These are some items that you want to look at before you walk into the closing table. Really, when you're walking into a closing, all of the due diligence, all of the reviews should have already been done. I always recommend to buyers, don't go into a closing thinking that this is your chance to review the documents and review the closing statement. Go into a closing understanding that all of this work has been done. Now you're just going to sign documents, hand over money, and exchange keys.
And now for people who might not have bought a house before, let me ask you some questions about the actual closing itself. First of all, why does the buyer have a stack of papers that's about 5 or 6 inches tall? And the seller has about 4 documents. Why is that, Nishad?
That's a great question. Most of these contracts are sold as is, and the only thing the seller needs to sign is a deed, an affidavit, and maybe a couple other documents that are related to some tax filings. The buyer, on the other hand, especially if they're getting a loan, has to sign a large stack of loan documents. And that loan documents consist of affidavits, consist of the actual note and the mortgage, and maybe some other documents that are required by lenders. The buyer may also have to sign additional closing documents that are required by a title company. But so since the buyer is taking this property, and usually they're getting a loan for it, they're going to have a lot more documents than the seller will, who's simply just signing over the deed and walking away with the net proceeds.
Absolutely. And we should get buyers ready, Nishad, because what they'll find, from my experience, is a document that says A, B, and C. And so they sign that. The next document will be, did you understand the document you just signed? And then you have to sign that. And then the next one will be, are you sure you really understood that?
That's correct. Yeah. Settlement agents, closing attorneys, title companies, these professionals are trained to go through the documents with the buyer, explain what they mean. So all buyers should take advantage of that. It doesn't make sense to me when a buyers quickly want to come in, sign everything, and leave. That's not the way this works. They need to take the time to understand what they're signing, what the restrictions are. And if they're comfortable with the documents, that's great, move on. But anything that they're not comfortable with, take the time to have the closing agent explain it to you.
Because every one of those documents protects the buyer's best interests.
That's correct. Sometimes they have restrictions. If you're a first-time home buyer, a lot of times you have to sign an affidavit that says you're going to occupy the property for the next 2 years. Buyers need to understand that they can't rent it out a year after they move into it. So some of these things are very important, and they need to make sure they fully understand what they're signing.
Now, I understand also that all the buyers in today's market, and the sellers too, I believe, have to provide government ID. Why is that, Nishad?
There's a lot of fraud, Stephen. And so a lot of lenders, a lot of sellers, a lot of underwriters want the buyers and sellers to confirm their identity. You have a lot of foreign owners who are absentee owners that may own properties and don't ever step foot in this country for years after they purchase it. So we need to verify the person who's buying the property, the person who's selling the property are who they say they are, to make sure we can avoid any of the fraudulent real estate transactions that are very common, unfortunately, when it comes to residential real estate, especially vacant lots.
And another big issue, what about the money? If I'm getting a mortgage, I know the lender will wire the money to your firm, and it'll be waiting there for disbursement later after the settlement is done. But what if there's a little discrepancy between what the lender provides and what is really needed? Can I just write a personal check if it's a small amount? Or will I find out about that discrepancy ahead of time and have to get a certified check?
Yeah, things have changed quite a bit, Stephen, since I've been doing this. So you used to be able to write a personal check on the day of closing, and that would be okay. These days, most closing agents expect you to wire funds before you arrive at the closing. Most of the real estate contracts required the closing agent to have collected funds on the day of closing. Collected means funds that have been cleared. A personal check is going to take a few days, sometimes even a few weeks to clear. And so technically, a closing agent cannot close until they have all of the money cleared in their account. Therefore, a wire is the best option. The cashier's check may not work, especially with the how good the bad guys and girls have become in duplicating these cashier's checks and personal checks. So most closing agents steer away from checks. Most of them want wires before you show up to closing. And these numbers should not change. That's why the CFPB requires these disclosures to the buyer to make sure they understand the numbers and they know how much they need to bring to closing. So there shouldn't be a discrepancy, in my opinion. Sometimes things happen. Maybe it's a few dollars here and there. And again, your title company may require you to wire those funds. But Most of the time, if you get the documents in time, you review the closing documents, there shouldn't be a discrepancy. The funds have to be wired to the closing agent. That's the best way to do it. You can keep track of the funds and you can clear the funds on the day of closing as required by most of these contracts.
Oh, well, that's great to know. And I know that sometimes that final walkthrough might come up with some problems. You know, for instance, a seller who leaves a bunch of paint cans and they have to be removed. How do you handle those?
Well, that's where the agents come in, and it requires a lot of negotiations, right? So either you got to convince the seller to remove the paint cans, or the buyer has to assume the responsibility, or there has to be some sort of credit at closing from the seller to the buyer to have to take over that responsibility. So there's different ways that that can be handled. But a lot of times these closing statements are approved by lender, approved by underwriting, and they cannot change. So sometimes those things have to be handled outside of the closing.
Nishad, a few times you've mentioned the bad guys out there, the scammers, the people who try to make a buck by cheating people who are involved in real estate transactions. So let me ask you this. If I want to make sure my money goes to the right place when I'm buying a house and make sure no scammer can lay a glove on me, what do I do?
Do your research, right? First, call and confirm to who you are sending money to before you send it. Always confirm the account number. Always confirm the identity. Do some research online. Look at their website. Check their licenses. Check their referral sources or any other references they may have. It's always important to do your research before sending out money. I have had many clients who have called me that receive fake emails, especially people who are using these email accounts that don't have security filters. A lot of older email service providers don't have those kind of security filters, so it's easy for someone to see your emails and send you an email that makes it look like it's coming straight from the title company. I can spend hours, Stephen, telling you of how sophisticated some of these frauds have been, where it's easy to be tricked. So you just want to be careful. The best advice is to call and confirm. Sometimes you want to call and confirm twice because they're even able to change the numbers that you call. So just be careful with your emails. The more questions you ask, the more research you do, the more comfortable you should be.
Excellent, because that is a big threat to people. And Nishad, finally, once closing day rolls around for the buyer, what happens when they actually get to your office and go through the process and then leave? Are they the owners at that point?
Not necessarily. A lot of times you have to wait until the sellers come in, receive the documents, and actually receive the funds. A good closing agent would send out a communication to all parties. We've received all the documents signed by the buyers. We've sent the money to the sellers, and we're officially closed. Especially nowadays when buyers come at separate times, sellers come at separate times, until you receive some sort of notification from the settlement agent that the transaction has officially closed, it doesn't mean that you've actually closed just because you've come in and signed the documents.
I see. You know, not all buyers, of course, are first-time buyers. If you're a repeat buyer, how important is it for you to bring in your mortgage satisfaction form if you had a mortgage earlier, which you paid off?
That's very important. A lot of lenders want to confirm that all other debt has been paid off. So if you are a buyer who is coming in and has bought repeatedly and have taken loans out, usually from the same lender repeatedly, it's important to come to closing with the satisfaction showing that those loans have been paid off so you don't have multiple loans out there on the same property.
And now, does the buyer in 2025 actually get the keys to the property at the end of the closing appointment? Or does it happen some other way?
Well, with technology these days, people don't even have keys. They might just get a code to get into the house or a key fob. So there's different ways I've seen it. I don't know, last time I used a key, we have a keypad in our house. But a lot of times what will happen is either the agent or the closing agent will hold on to the keys, the codes, and anything else. And that's another thing is it's not just the keys these days. You want to make sure you get the Wi-Fi password. Sometimes you need codes to get into the camera. Sometimes you need codes to get into the server. So remember, it's not just the keys. The buyers should also get all of the security codes. Try to get any warranties that they have on things such as pools or roofs so that if there's any issue, they can file a claim under those warranties. Try to get as much information that you will need in the future from that property. But usually the closing agent will hold on to these items and then will hand them off to the buyer once the seller has officially received their money and the closing has been completed.
And that raises a good point because some of this work has to be done by the seller. They have to collect all those codes. They have to collect the keys if there are any. And anything that has to do with the internet that still exists in the house, they need to make sure that the buyer has very clear instructions and passwords and everything else they'll need to use that house.
That's correct, Stephen. And this is where the agents really come in. There's a lot of good checklists out there where both a seller and buyer can go through and make sure they have everything they need. But you are correct. A seller needs to get everything together and make sure there's some sort of handoff to the buyer so that you don't have to reach out to the seller after closing, or you don't have to reach out to the agent to reach out to the seller after closing. You want to try to get as much done before closing as possible.
And this may be an old-fashioned thing, Nishad, but I remember in all the homes I bought, one of the questions the settlement attorney would ask is, have you officially changed your address with the U.S. Postal Service? Does that still happen?
That still happens. Yes, that's still a problem. You always want to remember to change your address so that the buyer doesn't get your mail and you don't lose anything in between. So that's a good point. That where the seller should forward their mail to a new address. They should also provide their new address to the closing agent in case they need to send any money back or send any documents to them or make any corrections to the documents that have already been signed.
And so, Nishad, to sum it up, what would be your best advice to buyers and sellers if they're approaching the settlement day? Beginning with buyers, what would you tell a buyer in the summer of 2025 that they must know before they go to closing?
Closings have definitely changed from what they used to be like 10, 15, 20 years ago. No one really goes to the closing table. And although there's some title companies and closing agents that'll do it this way, but most buyers and sellers will handle the closing separately on their own and everything else will be signed electronically. So as a buyer, you want to make sure you have a good checklist and you review everything before the day of closing. Only go there to ask questions on any documents that you may have already reviewed. You want to make sure you look at the settlement statement ahead of time. You want to make sure that the funds are there and they're cleared. There aren't any last minute changes. And this requires proper planning. That's why a lot of times I recommend to buyers don't rush into these contracts. Yeah, it might be nice for a seller if you have a quick closing on a cash offer, but that may not be the best thing for you as a buyer because you want to make sure you have time to thoroughly review everything as well as do your due diligence on these properties.
And the same question now about a seller. If I am selling my house and I'm approaching closing day, what should I know, Nishad?
So as a seller, we touched on this before, make sure you have everything you need to hand over to that buyer so that when they move into that house, they don't have to reach out and get any codes or access codes or any other keys. A lot of these homes have multiple keys for different doors. You want to gather all of these things together. You also want to make sure that you provide a forwarding address to the title company as well as the agents involved in case there's any mail or any information that comes to the buyer after they close. And most importantly, don't hide anything from the buyer. Most states require the sellers to disclose any material defects that the buyer cannot see. So if there's anything that the buyer should know or any concerns that you have before the buyer closes on that property, it's best to tell them than to hide it and receive a lawsuit later on when the buyer discovers it on their own.
Absolutely. And Nishad, I've got to tell you, this has been a fascinating conversation because I've been to dozens of closings of my own and also as a realtor back when I was actually an agent. And it's amazing how much the process has changed, as you said. And I not only want to thank you for being with us today, I want to thank you for bringing us up to date into 2025 when it comes to the closing. Thank you, Nishad.
You're very welcome, Stephen. Happy to be here, and I hope everyone has a great summer.
Nishad Khan, board-certified real estate attorney with Nishad Khan Law in Orlando, Florida. Nishad is also a broker, a speaker, and faculty member who teaches classes about the closing at the Orlando Regional Realtor Association.
You're listening to Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque.
And now it's time for Beyond the Basics, in which we bring your real estate knowledge to the next level. So, as we discuss a successful settlement on today's show, let's dive deeper into something we briefly talked about a few minutes ago, and that is handling the mail that arrives at your new place. It sounds easy, but sometimes it's not. Now, if you're the buyer, contact the U.S. Postal Service and fill out their official change of address form about a week before you move into that new house. It's free if you do it in person, and online, it only costs about $1. But it's important, because without that change, you won't get any of your mail at the new address. But even if you do that and you do it correctly, you still might get the seller's mail, the people who don't live there anymore. It might be junk mail, or magazines, or possibly government letters, bank statements, or other important items. Now, a few days of overlap is natural, but if your mailbox keeps filling up with the seller's mail week after week, month after month, what do? Well, legally, you don't really have to do anything. Their mail is not your responsibility. It's theirs. There's no legal requirement for you to forward their mail. But it gets a little tricky, because even though you don't have to send them their mail, well, you cannot destroy it, and you cannot open it either, because both of those actions are against the law. They're federal crimes, and you could get in big trouble. So, here are a few ideas on how to handle it if you keep getting the former owner's mail. First, you could write "Return to Sender" or "Not at this address" on every envelope and put the mail back in the mailbox. Or you can talk to your letter carrier and tell them that the former owner no longer lives there. And you could also do the same thing by visiting your local post office. Also, you could contact the seller and tell them it's happening. You probably have their new contact information because it was in the settlement documents. Or again, you could just put all their mail in a great big shopping bag and forget about it. Remember, you cannot destroy it and you cannot open it, but you have no legal requirement to forward it to them. So that shopping bag could stay in your garage for years, and you have broken no laws. But the easiest way, and probably the nicest way, the most neighborly thing to do, is to just tell the post office. They'll take care of it, and you won't have to worry about a big pile of old mail, and you won't be breaking any laws. So, if it happens to you, consider just dropping by the post office. Give them the seller's mail you received and tell them about the problem, that they don't live there anymore. Now that's a good move. It's official, it's legal, and it's just plain nice. And the best way to guarantee that at your new house, all you'll be getting is your new mail. Next time on Real Estate This Week, how to buy a house. The market is changing in many places, and buyers have a better shot. we'll have expert advice on how to use those changes to help you win the house you love this summer. That's next on Real Estate This Week. And until then, I'm Stephen Gasque, and thank you for listening.
A brand new episode of Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque drops every Thursday, everywhere. And you're invited to listen, subscribe, and follow us. Just look for Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque. The best real estate strategies out there, just for you.